Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 27th year, I talk to writers about their craft, what they're working on now, what they've accomplished in the past, what they're planning for the future. We often have on poets and other brands of writers, journalists, novelists, short story writers, but it's a wider net than that. Sometimes we have on sculptors, we've had on musicians, we've had on actors, all sorts of artists. If you have an idea for someone who might be a good guest for the Writer's Block, whether it's a writer or another brand of artist, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd be very happy to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that the Writer's Block is a production created right here on KPAN by KPAN TV. It is a result of community access television. It's not a service you get if you subscribe to Dish. So don't pay attention to those ads on television asking you to switch from cable. Tonight, I'm happy to say we do have a writer, a very polished and experienced and award-winning writer by the name of Janet Young, who was on the show in 2007, and because she's accomplished a lot since then, I thought it would be a great idea to have her back. Janet Young was originally from Hicksville, New York, which is not upstate, it's on Long Island, and she lived there until she was a young girl of 13 when her family moved to Beverly, Massachusetts, and she has been on or near Cape Ann ever since. She went to Beverly High School, she graduated from Salem State, and then took a master's degree at Boston University. Her books on teens and their world when it coincides with mental illness include The Opposite of Music, which she spoke about on her last visit, My Beautiful Failure, and Things I Shouldn't Think. She's received writing honors from Penn, New England, IndieBound, Borders, Publishers Weekly, and other organizations. She presents her books and lectures frequently to organizations related to publishing and to mental illness. And she is also an editor and a public relations agent. Janet, thanks for being with us.
Thanks very much for having me on the show, John. It's a pleasure.
You've taken on a lot of hats since
Yes.
you were on last, and I want to hope we can get to touch all of them.
Okay.
The first thing I said I wanted to mention on the show, we talked about before the show. Tell us about how you first discovered writing when you were a girl and how that worked.
I was in Dutch Lane School in Hicksville, New York, and the school system there was excellent. And the teachers had the opportunity to really focus on and appreciate the kids sufficiently so that they could see what their abilities were. And when I was in maybe third grade, a teacher told my mother that I had writing ability, and my mother had a very high regard for authors and for books. She was reading all the time, and she focused on that, and she encouraged me in my writing from that point onward. And I also, there was some coverage in our Long Island newspaper about the book Winnie the Pooh being reissued in some kind of, you might say, dumbed down version. It may have been issued by Disney. I'm not sure who was responsible for this. But I was unhappy about that because I loved that book. And my mother said, well, why don't you write a letter to the editor? And I did. And so I was published for the first time at age 8. And not only did my letter appear, but there was another letter from another newspaper reader on the same subject. And the editors decided to run an op-ed that day about the rewriting of Winnie the Pooh, specifically addressing my letter. So I got to experience the power of being in print at a young age.
Fame at 8.
Yeah.
I love those stories where the teachers have influence and real.
Yes.
They're recognized for their influence and perception,
Yeah.
and the parents support them. That's a wonderful story.
And it's so unfortunate when you get into situations where there are too many students in the classroom for the teacher to be able to pay attention to those special gifts.
Yeah, yeah. I want to jump a little bit. Now, you were in
Okay.
Hicksville, but your
Yes.
family moved to Beverly.
Yes.
And somewhere in between going to Salem State and taking a master's at BU, you became interested in writing young adult novels that have to do with teens and mental illness.
Yes.
And can you tell us about that transition and where that came from?
I would say that came a little later in that whole transition. When I was a teenager, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know I was going to write for teens. Actually, this was a gift to me wrapped up in an insult, because I was in this creative writing program at Boston University, and one of the other writers, who happened to be British, although I'm not sure that makes any difference, but she was this very cool, kind of edgy person. She said to me, "Your writing is like children's books. It's like frozen peas in the supermarket. That it's a commercial product, but the green peas look so bright against the white background." Something like that.
What
Having
a
to do-
snot.
Yeah, but then somehow, although I'm not remembering exactly, I thought, well, maybe I should write for kids. And then the more I thought about it, the more I liked other books that were for teens. And there's a certain freedom inherent in writing for teens, because your readers aren't been there, done that. They're encountering many, many things for the first time. And so they're open-minded, and it's a great opportunity to teach them a lot about not just mental illness, but about the culture surrounding it, because a lot of my work has to do with the cultural perception of mental illness as much as the illness itself.
I am impressed by your maturity. To be in college, I certainly wasn't that mature in college, and not to go punch that other writer in the nose and get ticked off. Although
Well,
I'm sure at the moment you were a little.
One of the things was that
dismayed.
the director of the program really liked my work, and so I knew I had something going for me. It wasn't, so I didn't, I got a certain amount of encouragement through that year, and I was able to put it in
Was
perspective.
this at BU or Salem
At
State?
BU.
BU.
Leslie Epstein was the director of the program, and he liked my work.
Oh, good.
I don't
good.
know if people are very familiar with his books. Maybe now his son is more familiar to most people. He's Theo Epstein,
Theo?
the person who helped the Red
I was
Sox
gonna
win
ask.
the World Series a few years ago
Yeah.
for the first time
And
in a
now,
long time.
and now the Cubs.
Yeah.
Now the Cubs. So you started writing or thinking of writing for teenagers
Yes.
when you were in grad school, and that
I guess so.
evolved to several novels which you've brought.
Yes.
And the first one, which I mentioned, you spoke about when you were on the show last time.
10 years ago.
The
yes.
Opposite of Music. Now we have a graphic of the cover,
Okay.
and the director, Becky, is going to be showing that. Can you
Okay.
tell us briefly about The Opposite of Music and how that was conceived and developed?
Yes. The Opposite of Music is about a family helping their father through a clinical depression. It's there's the mother of the family and the two teenage kids. Well, the boy Billy is the main character. He's 15. His younger sister is Linda, who's 12. The father gets diagnosed with a very tough depression, and it doesn't respond well to the initial attempts with medication and so on. And because the mother distrusts doctors in general, she decides that the family is going to take the father out of the conventional medical setting and treat him at home using alternative or holistic therapies. And as a result, he gets worse. And the whole family becomes very mired in his illness. I would say that in a way, the whole family gets sick. It becomes a family illness instead of an individual's illness. And so yes.
No, go ahead.
Okay. It demonstrates several things. First of all, how the illness of one family member affects the whole family, and often affects people in different ways. For instance, some people might become secretive and isolate. Others may reach out to friends and other family members for help. We all have our own style of coping with a crisis. Another thing that is represented here is the way the community acts toward him and his family, and it shows a boy as a caregiver. We often think of girls and women as the caregivers, but this 15-year-old boy will do just about anything, including putting schoolwork and his friends on the back burner because he is dedicated to saving his father's life.
I think that approach is really fascinating. And I remember now talking about it. It's not about and at least initially, a teen being mentally ill. And
That's right.
It's not like a rebel without a cause going berserk. It's about the family and how teens adjust.
Yes.
You said before the program that the second book in the series, My Beautiful Failure, is a sequel
Yeah.
to the first.
Yep.
How does now this is the second book in the two-book series, My Beautiful Failure. I love the title.
Thank you.
We're going to show that
Okay.
on the screen as well. And tell us about that sequel and how
Okay.
it evolved.
And when you show the graphics, I think your viewers will appreciate the kind of very depressing covers that I often get from my publisher, because we see here two teenagers, one for the boy from The Opposite of Music, and now the girl from My Beautiful Failure, both looking like they're in a state of emotional collapse. But believe it or not, that sells books. That kind of angst, teens, especially teen girls, like to read about this type of crisis and trouble.
This would be a good place because we're talking about marketing. Where can these books, where can our audience, our TV audience, buy these books?
Well, all of my books are usually on the shelf at the bookstore of Gloucester on Main Street. And they're not always in Barnes & Noble, but they would always be available on Amazon and any of those online booksellers.
So, bookstore in Gloucester.
Yeah.
And usually, always Amazon,
Yeah.
often Barnes & Noble.
Yeah.
So give them a little
And
business.
if people don't have that much of a budget, they can probably get all my books from the Sawyer Free Library,
Good idea. Good idea.
the teen room.
Tell us the story behind My Beautiful Failure. Is
Okay.
it the same family?
Yes, it's the same family. And Billy Morrison, having gone through all this with his father, believes that he knows a lot about psychology. In fact, he intends by the end of this book to become a psychologist.
The end of
By the end of The Opposite of Music. And he realizes that he's gotten too wrapped up in his family over the past year, and he should be expanding his world a little bit. And so he volunteers on a suicide hotline. And he thinks that he has the skills. He thinks that he's probably the best, most qualified person on there. And he's talking
And of
to
course
other
he's
teens.
not, right.
And not only that, but he breaks a lot of the rules, and he falls in love with one of the callers, who is a very troubled girl, and she is the person who's depicted on this cover.
Does he help her?
Well,
that would be a spoiler.
it would be a spoiler, you're right. And I think what we all have to remember, as much as we want to help those around us who have mental illness or addiction or anything else, we always have to be very careful not to try to be the hero and not to have the situation become about us and how great we are and how much we're helping.
The title's a little bit of a giveaway, I think.
My Beautiful Failure, that is a theme that applies to several situations in the book. And one thing is that Jenny, who started out as a very gifted person, not only a very bright student, but also an excellent athlete, a swimmer, she believes she has a kind of breakdown and believes that she's now a failure. And so a lot of the book revolves around the idea of what makes someone a failure.
What year did The Opposite of Music come out?
That came out in 2007.
And what year did My Beautiful Failure come out?
I believe that was 2012.
Does it take you 4 or 5 years to
No, that
write and polish a novel?
Oh, no. Strangely enough, although I'm glad we talked about those two books together, this one,
The
Things
third-
I Shouldn't Think, on a different topic, came
Okay.
flying in and was published in between the two parts of the sequel.
Okay, let's make sure we give Becky a warning here. Now we're going to switch to the third book, which is Things I Shouldn't Think by Janet Ruth Young. And although the first two books we talked about are in sequence in the sequel, they were
Yes.
not written in sequence. You wrote between them Things I Shouldn't Think.
Well, John, I'd
So-
like to correct you there because
Well-
I wrote these in sequence, but they were published out of order. And I'm going to tell you and your audience something about the publishing world.
Please.
In the past 10 years since I've appeared on the show, I've had my share of triumphs, but also of very stressful periods and some heartbreak. And right after The Opposite of Music was published, the reviews were very favorable. And so my publisher, Simon & Schuster, gave me a 2-book contract to write 2 more books. And so I had been working on My Beautiful Failure, the sequel. But my editor called me and said there had been some reorganization, as there often is in a publishing company, and I really shouldn't have gotten this contract for My Beautiful Failure because the sales of The Opposite of Music were not sufficient to support a sequel. And somehow, in my publisher's office in New York City, the capital of publishing, no one realized it was a sequel, even though there was the same character in there and the same themes. And so someone had made a mistake. Now, I had been going along writing this book, and when I heard that, I was utterly dejected. However, there was a bright side. They said, well, what about this other book that we have contracted you for? This book about obsessive compulsive disorder, things I shouldn't think. What if you go and you write that now? Now you've already been working on this one. Switch gears, write the 3rd book, and we're going to publish that next and hold off on My Beautiful Failure, hoping that this book gets more attention and then it brings all of your work into more prominence.
And did you, and did it?
I would say that those things both happened, but it was very difficult because I had been working on the other book, the sequel, and it caused me to distrust my editor and my publisher. I thought, are they just blowing me off?
Well, in fact, when you said that they had made a mistake, I thought, from my experience with publishers,
Yeah.
instantly, that's a lie. They didn't make a mistake. They just changed their minds and are covering their ass.
All those thoughts went through my mind, and then I thought, I have been through all of this writing this book, which, judging from the subject matter, as you can tell, it was quite arduous, writing a book about a suicide hotline, and now I'm supposed to somehow pull myself together, get all fresh and creative again, and switch to this other book about obsessive compulsive disorder. But this ended up being quite critically successful. In fact, it got a starred review in Publishers Weekly, and it was longlisted for the National Book Award. However, the long list is not an official designation.
Things I shouldn't think was on the long list. Well, that's an honor. That's an honor.
I only found out about it through kind of subterranean
How long is the
channels.
long list, dare I ask? 30,
Well,
40 books?
25.
25.
And then the official list of finalists is 5, and then 1 wins. But one of the National Book Award people aren't allowed to tell what books they're looking at for some period of time. They're sworn to secrecy. But after the book awards had been presented, one member of the panel wrote a blog post about the 20 other great books that had been strongly discussed, and that book was on the list.
What year did that come out?
2011. And then this one came out in 2012,
Now-
so it really happened.
How long did the sandwich book, things I shouldn't think, how long did that take you?
I would say it generally takes me 6 months to complete the first draft, because I already know what the story is going to be, but then it's a recursive process because I go and do more research, and then I build that research back into the successive drafts.
So, and then how many drafts, and what was the total time on the sandwich book as opposed to the other 2?
Well, maybe it only takes a year for all of it, but the steps are so spread out because I'm doing my writing and then it goes to my editor. We don't know how long they're going to have it for. And then I have to revise at least twice for the editor to get it to where they want it. But I would say any one of these books, my total hours would be a year of full-time work or maybe less, because I don't write from 9 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. It's only a few hours a day. When I was writing this book, my first book, The Opposite of Music, I knew what story I wanted to tell, and I divided it into 100 pieces, and I had to write one of those pieces every day, and I called them chapters, really. I'm just going to take a look at the book and see how many chapters are in here.
So this is
don't know.
interesting on the ins and
Okay.
outs of publishing. How many chapters are there?
I think there are somewhere between 80 and 100, and the task I set for myself was to write one of those little chapters every day. I would call them micro chapters, and some of the chapters were only one sentence long. So some days I only wrote one sentence, and then I said, I've done my work for the
You
day.
must have looked forward to those days.
Yeah. I think sometimes I would skim my list of chapters and look for the shortest ones.
Because
I didn't make myself do it out of
I'll do
order.
a short one
Yeah.
today.
Yeah,
Well,
I'll do a one sentence chapter, then I'll go to the beach.
The story about the publishers
Oh, yeah.
and you said the joys and victories and also the heartbreak
Mm-hmm.
is interesting. I think when people write well, as you do, it's sort of like watching a movie star. You think, oh, everything's glamour.
Yeah,
And of course,
yeah.
it's not.
It was very
I
difficult.
want to make sure that we get to
Okay.
your editing
Sure.
because I just saw the clock.
Okay.
You edit
Yeah.
for other authors. You do what the editors at Simon
Yes.
Schuster,
Mm-hmm.
although I'm sure you're nicer about it.
Most of the time, yeah.
Tell us,
Okay.
now, I don't know if do you have graphics of these as well?
Yes.
Okay, we will show then graphics of these books.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm going to name the books and then we'll show them in sequence.
Okay.
God is Not a Boy's Name, Pet Caregivers and Families, and A Passion for Discovery. So I think we will show the graphics in sequence, but we can just talk about the editing
Okay.
process
All right.
of God is Not a Boy's Name, Pet Caregivers and Families,
Mm-hmm.
and The Passion for Discovery. Where and when did you get the contracts or the ideas and contacts to do these books as an editor?
I get them through various ways. I worked at Houghton Mifflin for 15 years before I decided to devote myself to my own writing. So I did all this editing for what is one of the United States' top publishing companies, and that's where I got my editing skills. And I don't think there are many people who can offer both. It's really both sides of the desk, because I'm an award-winning author and I'm an editor. And so when I'm going out looking for clients, people know that. And each of these clients came to me in a different way. Some of them come through my old girl network from all the people that I knew at Houghton Mifflin. They might hear about someone who's looking for a freelance editor, and then they pass the referral on to me. In the case of God is Not a Boy's Name, this book is written by Lynn G. Brakeman, the Reverend Lynn G. Brakeman, who people...
Former guest on the Writer's Block.
And she and her husband were the pastors of St. John's Episcopal Church in Gloucester. And that, even though she lived in Gloucester and I live in Gloucester, interestingly enough, the referral came through my network of people I had worked with at Houghton Mifflin. Another editor that I knew there, a friend, had worked with Lynn at an earlier point of the book, and then for some reason, I think she was unavailable to help Lynn with the next stages, and then I was brought in.
Okay, that's the first one, God is Not a Boy's Name by
Yeah.
Lynn Brakeman. And the second book, tell us about the contact for Pet Caregivers and Families.
Well, this was really a funny
different kind of
story. I
topic.
was in Marblehead being an author, speaking at the Marblehead Festival for the Arts, and I was giving a reading from my book, Things I Shouldn't Think, and talking about that. And usually when I give a reading, I don't just sit there and read myself. I ask people from the audience to come up and read the book for me. And then I stop them and we have discussions. And I think that
That's an
enlivens
interesting
it.
approach.
Yeah, so people don't tune out. And I had one person to read that book. His name was Robert Brickelhammer. He lives in Marblehead, and he was there in the audience. And then after he met me at the reading, he said that he had written a book and he was looking for an editor. And then he was a first-time author, and that's how we got this relationship.
Just by luck,
Yeah,
circumstance.
because the world is loaded with people who want to write books. There are a lot of them on Cape Ann. I might put up a poster saying the Lanesville Post Office, and then I get a phone call from someone saying, I've written a book and I would like you to help me.
The lineup for the Writer's Block is often full
Yeah.
a year ahead of time.
Yeah, Yep.
The last book that you brought as an example of editing is A Passion for Discovery. Peter Freund at the University of Chicago, you mentioned. So that's a different story altogether.
Yes, he's a very high-level physicist at the University of Chicago, and he runs in those Nobel circles, and he knows the top physicists, mathematicians, and others. And he had worked on a book that was a series of stories about the lives of physicists and mathematicians. So it wasn't about the work, it was how their work combined with their life and the difficulties they faced. For instance, a number of physicists who worked when Hitler was in power and who weren't given credit for their own work because they were Jewish, things like that. And he already had his manuscript finished, and he even had an agent already, Wendy Strothman, who was quite prominent. She was the editor for Philip Roth, for instance. And she had been at Houghton Mifflin, and she said to Peter, your book is great, but before we can start shopping it around to publishers, you really need to do some work on it, and you should just hire someone to help you. So that's how I got that one.
So a person comes to the book, comes to you with a book as an editor. First, do you give basic conceptual reviews or feedback about how it should be arranged, or whether its treatment is to one side or the other?
I take the manuscript for about a week, and then I write a long memo of recommendations. And I look for completeness, sense, logic, make sure it flows, the information flows properly, whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
This is long before getting to commas and semicolons and
Right.
that kind of nitty-gritty
In editing-
galley-proof
In
stuff.
editing, we always go from the most general to the most specific. So is the book complete? Do you need to write another chapter? That you don't want to fix their punctuation and then tell them they need to write another chapter. And I'd like to back it up a bit further, if I may.
Quickly, we've got 20 seconds.
Because some people come to me, they say, I have an idea for a book, and they haven't written a sentence, and I help them even at the very beginning stages of conceptualizing the project.
And you'll take somebody on, they say, I've got an idea for a book.
Yeah, and I'll help them start getting it on paper. And
I'm going to have you back again, because we're just getting the conversation going, and I noticed that we're out of time.
That's amazing.
And I didn't get the half of the editorial questions I had, or to your PR work.
Okay.
But I do want to thank you very much, Janet Young, for talking about your novels and your teenage adult novels targeted the subject of mental illness, and your editing skills, and your awards, and your background. Thanks for coming down.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure again.
I want to thank our TV audience as well for being with us. If you've learned something about writing, if you've learned something about the ups and downs of publishing, the publishing business, if you've learned something about editing, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.